consultation is based on this document, Talking with Our Members, which is available in the foyer. The issue of tuition fees is a complex issue. In fact, the whole funding of higher education is extremely complex. And it was recently made even more complex by the Education Minister's announcement on a package of measures on support for students. But as a basic principle, we as Liberal Democrats believe that higher education should be free, and that principle was recently reconfirmed at the Federal Spring Conference. This consultation session is about how we apply our basic principles in the situation we have here in Wales, within the legal and financial constraints of the Assembly settlement. Briefly, financial support for students is divided into different segments. The first one is the tuition fee grant, which is payable to all, regardless of income, to all Welsh domiciled students, that is, who choose to study in Wales. Important caveats there. Jane Hart recently announced that this will no longer be paid from September 2010 to all new students. Then there's the Assembly Learning Grant, which is means tested and is intended to cover living expenses. Jane Hart announced this spring that this will be increased and will cover a wider range of families to be eligible. And then there are various scholarships and bursaries. At the moment they're pretty haphazard, but Jane Hart announced that there will be a national bursary scheme from September 2010 onwards. Now, the Labour government's announcement also included a couple of other measures, but they're minor measures and not central to the argument, so I won't be dealing with those this afternoon. The complexity of the package that Jane Hart announced, and it's in the consultation document, and the higher levels of Assembly Learning Grants, those two things together cannot disguise the fact that there will be, from the end of next year, a 40% cut in the total funding available for student support. And if you're looking for a campaigning issue, that is the big issue, and one which has been largely ignored so far. It is only we, as Welsh Liberal Democrats, who have emphasised that point. To my great surprise, neither NUS Wales nor UQ, the trade union for college lecturers, neither of them have stressed this point in their responses to the announcement. A 40% cut is very significant. Some students, of course, will get more, but many will get much less, if anything at all, in the future. Now, why was it necessary in the Assembly government's eyes to introduce this cut? Because there is a yawning £60 million per annum plus gap in the funding, the core funding available for universities in Wales in comparison with the funding available in England. And the gap has been allowed to grow so large that it is having a serious impact on the ability of our universities to compete, to attract students in competition with English universities. And it is a UK market in higher education. Labour allowed that funding gap to develop, to grow in the good times. Now they have their backs against the wall. They have clearly decided to take the money for lecturers' salaries, equipment, books and buildings out of the pockets of students. Now that's no surprise coming from Labour, because both Assembly Learning Grants and tuition fee grants were more or less thrust upon them. Assembly Learning Grants were thrust upon them by us when we were in the partnership government, and the tuition fee grant, which offsets the top-up fees, was thrust upon them by an opposition coalition of ourselves, Plaid and the Tories, when we had a minority Labour but it comes as a surprise that Plaid have so easily abandoned their opposition to tuition fees. True, they got themselves in a terrible mess about it. There are deep divisions within the party, and I believe they made it all the worse by expelling a 17-year-old student who dared to criticise their leader. I mean, can you imagine that happening in the Welsh Liberal Democrats? Half of this would be gone. But the Tories as well have quietly dropped their opposition to fees. And as a result of a backroom agreement between Labour and Tories in Westminster, decisions on raising the cap on top-up fees have been put off until after the general election. No difficult decisions, please, so close to a general election. They've kicked the problem into the long grass. But even if we wished to do so, we can't do that. As your shadow education minister in the Assembly, I have to have a costed, fully developed policy for the next Assembly election in 2 years' time. Now, in a sense, this issue is easy for the general election. We can retain our simple opposition to tuition fees following the federal conference motion. In a Liberal Democrat world, where the Liberal Democrats are in government or have influence on government, we already know that as a result of our emphasis on education, our expanded funding for education, Wales would get, via the Barnett formula, an additional £300 million. 60 million of that would be the higher education section of it, and would be enough to cover all reasonable proposals. But what we have to do is to develop a robust policy which will apply the principles that we agree with beyond the general election. Should the unexpected happen and we wake up the morning after the general election and Vince Cable isn't installed in number 11 Downing Street? So I want to draw your attention to the questions in the document, talking to our members, and there are 6 questions, and to paraphrase what they mean. The first question: do we continue to support the view that education should be free, or are we going to depart from that long-held basic principle? Second question: do we stick with the tuition fee grant available to all, regardless of income, which has been our way in Wales of offsetting the impact of tuition fees, which are the responsibility of the UK government? Complex legality here. All we can do is offset the tuition fees. We can't change the level of them. It's also, by the way, been a way, and designed to be a way, of encouraging Welsh students to study in Wales. That's good for Welsh universities, and it's good for the future working population of Wales, because we all know a very large proportion of students tend to stay on in the place where they have studied. Conversely, if you go to England to go to university, you're more likely to stay there. The third question is that there has been a big omission from the discussion so far, and that is part-time students. And they are an increasing proportion of the number of students in Wales. Take Newport University, for example, actually a majority of its students are part-time. Gone are the days when part-time students were financially supported by their employers and had well-paid jobs and could afford easily to pay for higher education. As a party of fairness and equality of opportunity, I believe we have to do something to help part-time students. And that is something which hasn't been tackled up to now by the current system and hasn't been covered so far by Jane Platt's proposals, but may of course be covered in